Imagine you're sitting down to write a letter. It is the autumn of 1347. You're in Messina, a busy port city on the northeastern tip of Sicily. Outside your window, the harbor is visible. Ships are arriving. You do not know yet what those ships are carrying. You do not know that the man you are writing to, your brother, your merchant partner, your husband, will be dead within 4 months. You do not know that you will be dead within 6. You do not know that the world you inhabit, the world you have always known, is about to be interrupted so completely that historians 700 years later will still be trying to measure the wound. You just know that you miss him, that the autumn light is beautiful today, that you wanted him to know. This is not a video about statistics. The statistics exist, and they are staggering, but they are not the story we are telling today. This is a video about the people inside those statistics, the lovers separated by quarantine, the parents who buried children, the neighbors who showed up with food when showing up with food was an act of genuine courage, the survivors who woke up one morning to find that everyone they had organized their life around was gone and had to decide, quietly, with no fanfare, what to do next. This is a video about 1347, about the year the plague arrived in Europe, about what love looked like in the shadow of it, about what loss felt like when loss was happening to absolutely everyone, everywhere, all at once, and about what survival, real survival, not just physical survival, but the survival of the human impulse to connect, actually required. Stay with me. The history here is extraordinary, but it is the people inside the history who will stay with you. We tell stories that matter about the people who shaped our world. If you want to journey deeper into history with us, hit subscribe. Let's uncover the past together. Before we can understand what the plague took, we need to understand what it found. Europe in 1347 was not the dark, static, superstitious place that popular imagination sometimes pictures. It was a continent in motion, economically, culturally, intellectually. It was loud, smelly, hierarchical, deeply religious, occasionally brutal, and in many ways extraordinarily alive. The cities of northern Italy, Florence, Siena, Venice, Genoa, were among the most economically sophisticated places on earth in 1347. Florentine banking houses were financing kings. Venetian merchants were negotiating directly with sultans. The wool trade connecting England to Flemish weavers to Italian merchants was a supply chain of staggering complexity. And threaded through it all, sustaining all of it, were relationships. Personal, commercial, familial, romantic. Medieval people were not less emotionally complex than we are. They were not less capable of love or grief or fear or hope. They simply expressed those things within a different framework, one built from Catholic theology, feudal obligation, guild solidarity, and the particular intimacies of a world where most people lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. Marriage in 1347 was rarely purely romantic in the modern sense. It was economic, strategic, familial, but that does not mean it was without love. Medieval letters, wills, and poetry are full of evidence of genuine, deep affection between spouses. The Italian poet Francesco Petrarch, who we will return to, spent decades writing some of the most beautiful love poetry in Western history, haunted by a woman named Laura, whom he loved and who would die of the plague in 1348. The Paston Letters, a collection of correspondence from a slightly later English family, give us a window into medieval domestic life that is startlingly recognizable. People worried about money, they argued about inheritance, they fussed over sick children, they wrote to say they missed each other. And then there were the bonds of community that structured everyday life in ways we often underestimate. The guild system meant that a craftsman's professional identity was also his social identity. His colleagues were his neighbors, his drinking companions, the men who would carry his coffin. The parish church was not just a place of worship, it was the organizing institution of neighborhood life, the record keeper of births and deaths and marriages, the place where community grief was collectively processed. The confraternities, lay religious brotherhoods that existed across Catholic Europe, organized mutual aid, care for the sick, burial of the poor. In Florence alone, there were dozens of them, each with its own rules, its own charitable responsibilities, its own community of members who had sworn to support one another. This was the world that 1347 found. A world of dense, layered, deeply personal human connection, and into it, moving along the very trade routes that had made that connection possible, came something that would test every single one of those bonds to its absolute limit. The ships arrived in Messina in October 1347. And everything that came before, every market, every letter, every wedding, every guild meeting, every parent putting a child to bed, was about to be divided into before and after.
Here is a question that the historical record cannot fully answer, but that I want to sit with for a moment. What did you do with your love when love became dangerous? The plague spread, we now know, through the bites of infected fleas carried by rats, and, in its pneumonic form, through respiratory droplets. Medieval people did not know this. What they observed was that proximity to the sick seemed to cause illness, that touch seemed to transmit something, that the people who cared for the dying often died themselves. And so the question of how to love someone, how to be physically, emotionally present for someone you loved, became a question with life or death stakes.
Giovanni Boccaccio, the Florentine writer who survived the plague and wrote about it with searing clarity, described what he witnessed in Florence in 1348, just 1 year after the plague's European arrival. What made this pestilence even serious was that it was spread by the sick to the well by contact, much as fire catches on to any dry or oily material placed beside it. In fact, the evil went further. Not only did it infect healthy persons who conversed or had any dealings with the sick, making them ill, but it also seemed to transfer the sickness to anyone touching the clothes or other objects that had been touched or used by the sick. And then, and this is the part that Boccaccio finds most devastating, more devastating even than the dying itself, he describes what people did with that knowledge. Such was the multitude of corpses that the sacred ground of the churches did not suffice for burial. Brothers abandoned brothers, uncles abandoned nephews, sisters left brothers, and very often wives abandoned husbands. Even more, and almost unbelievable, fathers and mothers refused to nurse and assist their own children, as if they were not their own.
I want to be careful here. Boccaccio is making a rhetorical point. He is writing literature, not a clinical study, and he is deliberately reaching for the most extreme examples to illustrate the extremity of the situation. The historical record also shows us abundantly the opposite. People who stayed, people who nursed, people who chose presence over safety. But his observation points to something real and genuinely terrible, that the plague created a situation in which loving someone, in the most fundamental physical sense,
Touching them, sitting beside them, holding their hand while they died, was an act that could kill you. And people made different choices. Some fled, some stayed, some found ways to care from a distance, leaving food at a threshold, calling through a door, praying in the street beneath a window. None of these choices were simple. None of them were cowardly or heroic in any uncomplicated way. They were human beings doing the impossible calculations that catastrophe forces, and getting them wrong and getting them right, and never knowing in advance which was which.
Now I want to tell you about Francesco Petrarch. Petrarch was, by 1347, one of the most celebrated literary figures in Europe. He had spent years, decades, writing poems to a woman he called Laura. Whether Laura was a real specific person or a poetic ideal has been debated by scholars for centuries. But what is not debated is that Petrarch's love for her, real or idealized, was the organizing passion of his creative life. On April 6, 1348, Laura died of the plague, and Petrarch, who was traveling abroad and learned of her death by letter, wrote one of the most extraordinary documents of personal grief that the 14th century produced. Laura, illustrious through her own virtues and long celebrated in my verses, first appeared to my eyes in my youth in the year of our Lord 1327, on the 6th day of April in the church of St. Clare in Avignon at Matins, and in the same city also on the 6th day of April at the same first hour, but in the year 1348 the light of her life was withdrawn from the light of day, while I, as it chanced, was at Verona, unconscious of my fate. The tidings reached me at Parma in a letter from my Ludovicus on the 19th day of May of the same year. Her chaste and lovely form was laid in the church of the Franciscans on the evening of the same day on which she died. I am persuaded that her soul returned to the heaven from which it came.
He recorded the date and hour of their first meeting, the date and hour of her death, the date and hour he received the news, the church where she was buried. He was in Verona when she died. He learned of it later by letter. He wasn't there. In the margin of a book he had carried for 20 years. That is grief. That is love surviving loss in the only way it can, by insisting on the specific details. The 6th of April, first hour, the church of St. Clare, as if writing it down was a way of not letting her become a statistic. He then wrote 366 poems, the Canzoniere, many of them about Laura after her death, imagining conversations with her, processing grief through beauty, making of her loss something that would last. Love, Petrarch showed us, does not stop at death. Sometimes it becomes most articulate there.
There is a particular kind of grief that has no name in English, though other languages have tried to find words for it. It is the grief of losing not just one person, but the entire constellation of people who gave your life its particular shape. The friend who knew you before you were who you are now, the parent whose presence defined what home meant, the sibling whose existence made you make sense to yourself. In the plague years, this kind of grief, total, constellation-destroying grief, was not exceptional. It was ordinary. Agnolo di Tura, the Sienese tax official whose account we encountered earlier in our documentary series, buried his 5 children with his own hands, not metaphorically, physically. He dug the graves, he placed the bodies, he covered them, and then he kept living, he kept writing. His chronicle continues after that sentence as though it must, because what else do you do? And in many places in Siena, great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitude of dead. And they died by the hundreds, both day and night, and all were thrown in those ditches and covered with earth.
And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. And I, Agnolo di Tura, called the fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And there were also those who were so sparsely covered with earth that the dogs dragged them forth and devoured many bodies throughout the city. There was no one who wept for any death, for all awaited death. And so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. There was no one who wept for any death. That line has stayed with me since I first encountered it. Read it carefully. He's not saying people did not feel grief. He is saying grief had become so universal, so total, so relentlessly present that the specific ritual of weeping, of publicly individually mourning one person, had become impossible. When everyone is dying, how do you mourn any single person? When the person who would normally help you grieve, your spouse, your parent, your oldest friend, is also gone.
The psychologists and grief researchers of our own era have a term, complicated grief, or what is now sometimes called prolonged grief disorder. It describes what happens when grief becomes stuck, when the normal process of mourning is disrupted or overwhelmed, when there is no space to process loss before the next loss arrives. Medieval people did not have this language, but they were living inside the condition it describes with a totality that we can barely imagine. Jean de Venette, the French Carmelite friar whose chronicle covers the plague years in and around Paris, offers an observation that is almost unbearable in its specificity. Many country villages and many hamlets had become completely deserted. No one remained in them except perhaps one sick person. One could not find anyone to bury the dead. Men and women carried their own children to the church and threw them into a common grave. From these pits such an appalling stench was given off that no one could stand by. After the cessation of the epidemic, the men and women who survived mated with each other. The women conceived readily, but gave birth to 3 or 4 children rather than the usual number. Moreover, the children who were born after the plague had only 2 or 3 teeth, as if nature herself was exhausted by the effort of survival. The detail about the teeth is almost certainly medieval medical mythology rather than clinical observation. But the image it conjures, nature itself weakened by the effort of survival, captures something emotionally true about the post-plague world. The survivors were not simply the same people who had lived through something difficult. They were people who had been fundamentally changed, carrying losses that had no names because the people who would have helped them name them were gone. And yet, the historical record of the plague years is not only a record of breakdown and loss. Running alongside it, sometimes almost invisible because it rarely made it into the chronicles, because ordinary kindness is rarely chronicled, is another record entirely, the record of people who showed up, who brought food to a threshold they were afraid to cross, who said prayers through a closed door, who sat with the dying when sitting with the dying could kill them, who organized in the rubble of institutional collapse informal networks of care that kept people alive. The Beguines, independent communities of lay women across northern Europe, continued nursing the sick through the plague with extraordinary courage. The flagellant movements that swept across Europe in 1348 and 1349 were extreme in their theology and sometimes dangerous in their effects, but they were also, at their core, communities of people trying to process collective grief through collective action. People reached for each other, even when reaching was dangerous, maybe especially then. There is a concept in trauma research called post-traumatic growth, the observation that some people in the aftermath of severe trauma report not just recovery, but a deepened appreciation for relationships, a clearer sense of personal priorities, a greater capacity for empathy.
The research is careful to note that this does not mean trauma is good. It means that human beings have a remarkable, stubborn capacity to integrate even devastating experience into something that orients them more deeply to what matters. Looking at the post-plague record, the wills leaving more to neighbors and the poor, the art that became more intimate and human, the literature that began asking harder questions about what a good life actually required, it is difficult not to see something like this at scale. A civilization that had been forced to confront mortality absolutely and had, in ways both conscious and unconscious, reorganized its values around that confrontation.
Survival in the aftermath of the plague was not a passive condition. It was a choice that had to be made, not once, but repeatedly, every morning. In a world that had lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of everyone you knew, survival required a kind of daily, deliberate recommitment to continuing that took enormous courage, even when it looked from the outside like simply getting up and going to work. For many survivors, work was the first form that re-engagement took, not because work was more important than grief, but because work was concrete when everything else felt abstract. You could put your hands on it. You could see it change. You could, at the end of a day, point at something that existed because you had made it exist. The economic historians who study the post-plague period have documented something that, once you understand the human context, is not surprising at all. The survivors worked with extraordinary productivity.
Wages rose, yes, partly because of simple supply and demand. Fewer workers meant higher bargaining power. But there is also evidence of something qualitative in the historical record, a seriousness of purpose, a willingness to take on responsibilities that had previously been blocked by rigid social hierarchies that were now suddenly permeable. The plague, in a deeply ironic historical twist, helped create the conditions for the end of serfdom in Western Europe. When lords needed workers badly enough, desperately enough, they began offering terms, better terms, terms that acknowledged for the first time in generations that the person doing the work had value that the market would now recognize. This is not a comfortable observation. We are not saying the plague was good. We are saying that historical change, even necessary, liberating change, sometimes emerges from catastrophe. The survivors did not choose their circumstances, but within those circumstances they made choices, and some of those choices, aggregated across thousands of ordinary people making small daily decisions about what they would and would not accept, changed the structure of their world. I want to return near the end of this video to Boccaccio, because his response to the plague, the Decameron, is one of the most instructive documents of survival that the 14th century produced. The premise of the Decameron, you will recall, is this. 10 young Florentines, 7 women and 3 men, retreat to a villa outside plague-ravaged Florence, and there, over 10 days, they tell each other stories. 100 stories, many of them comic, many romantic, some bawdy, some philosophical, a few genuinely dark. But all of them, and this is Boccaccio's point, I think, insistently alive, insistently engaged with human experience in all its messiness and richness and comedy and pathos. I intend to provide succor and diversion for the ladies, but not for those who have their mending, their household chores and their other family duties to keep them occupied. I mean those who are at leisure. For while the sun scorches the high hills and beats down on the lowlands, it is fine for those ladies to sit and tell stories, as perhaps they will, in order to cool the hours of the mid-afternoon heat. There is something gently, deliberately subversive about this. Boccaccio is not writing a theological treatise about how to endure suffering. He is not offering a philosophical framework for processing grief. He is offering stories, pleasure,
company. The particular kind of comfort that comes from sitting with people you trust and sharing something. This, Boccaccio is suggesting, is not a trivial response to catastrophe. This is the response. Story, community, the insistence on joy in the face of everything that argues against it. The Decameron was enormously popular almost immediately. People read it during the plague years and after. They copied it, shared it, translated it. Not because it helped them understand the plague medically or theologically, it doesn't really attempt that, but because it reminded them that human experience in all its ordinary richness was worth being curious about. That even in the worst circumstances, people were funny and romantic and foolish and brave and complicated. That the plague had not made humanity less interesting. That they were still themselves, even in the wreckage.
What survival asked of the people of 1347 and after was not heroism in the dramatic sense. There were dramatic acts of heroism, the nurses who kept working, the priests who kept administering last rites, the grave diggers who kept digging. Those people deserved their recognition. But most survival looked quieter than that. Most survival looked like getting up, making breakfast, going to the workshop, writing the letter, sitting down with a friend and telling a story, planting the field, teaching the child, falling in love again with appropriate terror, knowing exactly what love could lose. Most survival looked like choosing every day in small and unglamorous ways to keep being a person in the world. And it turns out that this ordinary, daily, undramatic insistence on continuing is what civilization is actually made of.
We began with an unfinished letter. A person sitting down to write to someone they loved, not knowing what was coming, not knowing that the ships in the harbor were about to change everything. I want to end with the possibility that somewhere, in some archive, in some monastery library, in some collection of medieval documents that scholars are still working through, that letter still exists, unfinished, still in the middle of whatever it was trying to say, and that it matters. That particular, specific, unrepeatable act of human reaching, one person writing to another because they wanted them to know they were thought of, matters even now. The plague of 1347 and the years that followed killed an almost unimaginable number of people. Estimates range from 25 to 50 million dead in Europe alone within 4 years. Every one of those people was someone's Petrarch's Laura, someone's 5 children, someone's unfinished letter. And the people who survived them carried them forward in the only ways available, in memory, in art, in the stubborn continuation of ordinary life, in the decision made again and again, quietly, without ceremony, to love again anyway, to plant again anyway, to build again anyway.
The cathedral ceilings of the late medieval period were built by people who had grown up in plague years. The poetry of the Italian Renaissance was written by writers who had been shaped by loss at a scale we struggle to imagine. The early stirrings of what we call modern medicine, the first serious European attempts to understand contagion and quarantine, came directly from the plague's terrible education. None of this redeems the loss. Nothing redeems the loss, but it testifies to something, to the particular, stubborn, occasionally magnificent quality of the human insistence on continuing. We are the inheritors of those survivors. Their choices to rebuild, to reconnect, to insist on the value of ordinary human life are part of what made the world that eventually made us. We did not choose to inherit a world shaped by catastrophe. Neither did they. But here we are. And here, in whatever form it takes for each of us, is the same question they faced. What do you do with your one life in full knowledge of what life costs? They answered it imperfectly, as we do, beautifully sometimes, as we do, with love that was complicated, and grief that was enormous, and survival that was quieter and harder and more daily than any story makes it look. They answered it by continuing, and so do we.